Hey guys, thanks for not choosing to click on this video. I'm Allen.
And I'm Derick.
And today we're talking about the controversial subject of free will.
And as you might have guessed, we believe free will is an illusion.
When we initially heard that we don't have free will, we found this idea wildly unreasonable. However, as we learned more, it became harder and harder to justify our original position.
And in this video, we'll cover the exact arguments that convinced us free will does not exist. And we'll leave it up to you to decide or to not decide whether free will is an illusion.
Alright guys, so now we're going to jump into exactly how we ended up not believing in free will. Before we get into any of the reasons, we just want to give a more personal story of how we ended up here, and that we weren't just people who started out being like, oh my god, I don't believe in free will. Because it sounds crazy the first time we heard it. And the main thing that we're going to talk about is that we both always grew up feeling like we were people who had a hard time believing certain things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I guess growing up, you see people believing in certain things like religion or, life after death. And for me, growing up personally, it just seemed like these people weren't believing in these things because they thought it was true. I didn't think they thought like the Bible was, the word of God and actually true. But it seemed like they were believing those certain things because it made them feel better about the world. And it was almost easier to live with that being the truth. Whereas if you tried to apply the inverse, that there's no free will, there's no life after death, there's no creator of the universe, we're all just bags of chemistry walking around, like that can be a pretty bleak existence for some people, and a lot of people can't handle that. So when growing up, I sort of just saw that disparity, and it made me realize that I had sort of like a dark intuition towards these things, that I'm like, these dark things are probably right, because nobody wants to believe them, but the universe doesn't care whether or not what the truth is makes you feel happy. And so that's sort of my take on it, and it's sort of how I felt, and it made me feel a little bit different from other people who tended to believe in these things growing up.
Yeah, and that's the main thing that I'm trying to portray as a message, is that it always just felt like, to me, and I think Derick agrees, it just felt like I stood out. Like I would go to church and I just didn't feel like I fit in. Like I would be asking these questions in my head, and I'm like, aren't other people asking these questions? And then I would ask them to them, and they would have some sort of answer that they were really sure of. And my problem isn't necessarily in having answers, because obviously I'm trying to say that I have answers right now, but it was always the feeling of like certainty. I would talk to people, and maybe like some of my friends would get in fights and they would know that they were going to win. And I've just never been someone who can be like, I know the outcome of what things are going to be. I can understand it as a strategy, where I'm like, if I'm going to go into sales, I need to think I'm going to get this deal in order to get the deal. But when I look at it on a meta level, I don't understand how you could actually behave when you're pursuing truth in that sort of dogmatic fashion. And that's what I really struggled with. I always just felt a little out of place, and I think Derick resonates with that too, and I think if you're watching this video, maybe you can resonate with that too, where it's what Derick was saying, it's just a dark intuition where you don't feel like certain things that people are saying could just possibly be right. Like it just sounds it just sounds like a fabrication. It just sounds crazy. There's some things that just have always sounded crazy to me growing up. Like I remember when I was 7, I asked my dad, how could Santa be real if he's on both sides of the earth when only half is dark, since it's nighttime only on half? And my dad stuttered and didn't give me an answer right away. So I'm like, oh, Santa's not real. And I figured that out when I was 7. And that's just kind of like it just shows me what my life was going to be like. Like I've always just kind of had a hesitation to believe in things quickly. So
yeah, and I think when you take that path to believe in different things, it sort of alienates you from the tribe. And I know personally in my early teenage years, mid-teenage years, I went into some existential dilemmas, some weird headspaces. Once you start kind of accepting these beliefs that not everybody has, and that seem a little bit more bleak, and they make your life a little bit more meaningless, and you can go into depersonalization, go through some pretty dark times, at least I went through. And really the way that I sort of came out of that was once I just started to read more about it, read more philosophers, their takes on it, and start to understand that other people have seen the exact same perspective, and a lot of people have thought really hard about it. and they've come out of it with meaning. And so what you can really take away from it, and what I really took away from it, is that you can have the value of being truthful in the way that you view the world. However, that's not mutually exclusive with living a meaningful life and being growth mindset oriented, you know, because that's something we're really about, is how do we better ourselves, you know, how do we become a better person, better friend, a better worker, etc., right? How do we make positive change in our life? But it's like, how do you dovetail that with the fact that we don't have any free will?
Exactly.
Right? Yeah. And so, you know, once you get into these thoughts and philosophers and existentialism, you really see that they're not mutually exclusive and they're not inherently contradictory.
That's really what led us to this. That's how we ended up here. And now we're going to jump into exactly what our reasons were that led us to not believe in free will, even though we were skeptical of it at first.
All right, guys, so we're going to jump into the definition of free will now. Now, the definition is extremely important because the more you talk about this with people, the more you start to realize that everybody is sort of talking past each other and using completely different definitions when they say the word free will. So what does believing in free will mean? Believing in free will means that in any past situation, you believe that you could have acted differently, that you could have done differently. Instead of picking the tomato, you picked the potato.
Oh, stop. I'm a potato. Excuse me. I'm a living, what else? Look at me. What else could I be?
Right? And instead of picking the blue car, you picked the red car. So in any given situation, and those are very simple situations that I brought up, but it literally means in every situation you could have done otherwise. Theoretically, you had freedom of will. You could have done whichever one. Now, this also obviously doesn't relate to situations where you're being forcibly held against your will, like in prison, right? You obviously, that's a different situation. You don't have any sort of freedom or volition in that situation regardless. And so we're talking about only situations really where, you know, there's not any unreasonable external forces placed on you and you are free to make those decisions.
All right, guys, so the first argument we're going to make is what we call you are your brain. And this is coming from the underlying assumption that you do not believe in souls. So if you do believe in souls, this one won't be particularly convincing for you. However, we will touch on that later in the video.
Yeah, and each one of these arguments that we're going to be making standalone are coherent with the logic, and they all lead to the same conclusion that free will does not exist. However, we're just putting this disclaimer out here now that if you do believe in a soul, you're not going to find this one convincing, and you should go to the argument, the next argument.
Exactly. We're just trying to be sensitive to the multitude of perspectives that are out there coming from different assumptions, because we all enter any new information with different assumptions. But we're just doing this one first because when we first heard about free will, we were already atheists and we didn't believe in souls already, so this convinced us really quickly. So the you are your brain is the basic it's the basic idea that everything you do is determined by the contents of your brain, and if you had a different brain, you would behave differently. So the best way to understand this is Alzheimer's. If you're like me and you know someone who has Alzheimer's, you know that who they were before and after they were afflicted with Alzheimer's, they are a completely different person now. And this isn't because of some supernatural reasoning. It's not unexplainable. It's just because of the buildup of the beta amaloid plaques in the mind, and that in turn changes who that person is on a fundamental level. It completely changes them because their brain is now different. There's no other arguments that can be made on why someone behaves differently after Alzheimer's. It's just the fact that their brain has changed, so have they. Yeah. And that goes into the idea that you are your brain, so if your brain changes, so do you.
So this leads into other examples too where you might have an injury in your brain, right? Like Phineas Gage back in the 1800s had an iron rod that went through his face, through his prefrontal cortex, and completely changed his behavior. And everyone around him was like, who is this new person that I've not known my entire life that just started acting in this way? And when you ask him, he even said, yeah, I don't know what's going on. I'm not responsible at my job anymore. I'm doing all these different behaviors. I have all these addiction problems now. Like, I'm not sure what happened. Like, I'm just a completely different person. This is before people started to put together that our brains were actually what was causing our behavior. Mm-hmm. And so basically all of these examples demonstrate that if your brain changes, your behavior changes.
Exactly.
And your behavior is really you. So whatever you do, it's caused by your brain. And that also ties into other examples pretty much all across the board, too.
And the last one we'll give is a guy named Charles Whitman who got a tumor on his brain, and he went up into a clock tower and shot a bunch of people. So in that example, when you first hear it, you're like, man, that's horrific, but I can kind of see what happened because he had a tumor on his brain. Now, if someone just went up and shot people in a clock tower, you'd be like, that's completely inexcusable. Not that Charles Whitman's actions aren't excusable either. It's just more understandable because you're like, man, he had a tumor on his brain, so it was making him crazy, okay? And if you're going to follow that logic to its conclusion, it pretty much means that, hey man, if you had anything different in your brain, you would behave differently. If you had a stronger cortex and you had a higher IQ, you would make different decisions. If your limbic system was messed up, maybe you won't have as many emotions. All of these things are tied to your brain, whether it's positive or negative, but most people only intuitively understand it when it's negative, like Alzheimer's, a rod going through your brain, or getting a tumor. However, all behaviors are determined by your brain, just like those things determine how you behave too.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so basically it's saying that your brain is causing your behavior.
Exactly.
And then what is causing the behavior of your brain, or why is your brain causing you to behave in that certain way? Well, your brain is basically just made up of biology, right? It's made up of neurons and the way those neurons interact with each other. And then biology, when you think about it, is constrained by the laws of chemistry. Chemistry all happens within the context of what is allowed by physics, and then physics kind of at the bottom level there, you have the laws of physics. So when people ask, naturally, well, if you don't have control over your actions, what is controlling your actions? Who does have control over your actions? And really, when you break it down, the laws of physics are the things that are controlling us at the end of the day. And it's complex to break it down from top to bottom, but when you build up on it, it's like if you start at physics and then go up to chemistry and then go up to biology, it'll get much more complex, and you could never predict someone's behavior by looking at quantum physics, right? But theoretically, you could. If you knew every single variable, like this would never happen, but if you knew every single variable of the state of your world and every position and speed of every single atom, then you theoretically would be able to predict something as complex as human behavior, even though we don't have computers, anywhere big enough to actually do that in practicality.
And that can sound crazy at first because you're like, there's no way any computation could be made in that way. But all we're saying is that this elucidates the idea that science is closing in on what is supernatural and what isn't. Because if you look back to 1,000 or like 5,000 years ago, you'd be like, something like lightning was a supernatural phenomenon. Now, over the last 5,000 years, that box has closed in, and we know that lightning is not a supernatural phenomenon. It's explainable by the laws of physics and how electricity works. Yeah. So we're pretty much just saying that because things start with physics, and then they go to chemistry, and then they go to biology, and then they go to psychology, just because we don't know the roadmap fully doesn't mean that there's space for supernatural answers.
And you can see it already starting to happen too. They have prediction machines where they put your head in an MRI, and even with our rudimentary understanding of psychology and biology, they're still able to predict which, if they give you an option between picking red or green button, they know which button you're going to press before you can say which button you're going to press. And so these machines, even though we don't understand these things perfectly, they're already closing the gap like Alan was talking about. And it's just going to be a matter of time before it's all understood, and machines are going to be able to predict your behavior a lot better than they are right now.
I have to pair it with you.
Pair what with me?
You can improvise a little, but most of what you say was designed upstairs. Same as the rest of you.
This is just a cheap trick. I've run a brothel for 10 years, and if there's one thing I know, it's when I'm being fucked with. This can't possibly... I can't.
Okay guys, so now we're going to launch into what we call the where is your control perspective. And so we're going to go over some examples that elucidate things that you already know you don't have control over, and then we're going to try to find the line on where you start having control over these certain factors.
Exactly. So there's really simple things like that we all agree on that we don't have control over. So things like you don't control where you're born, you don't control who your parents are, you don't control your genes, you don't control your eye color, you don't control your IQ. We all can agree that we don't have control over those things. But then something like, do you have control over whether or not you chose to drink coffee? That's a little more vague. There's arguments that could be made on both sides whether or not that you have control when you're doing that, and there's good arguments to be made on both of those. However, it's really obviously that you don't control where you're born. So where is the line? Where do you start having control? And what we're going to argue right now is that there is no line, and that thinking that that line changes is an illusion.
Yeah, so for instance, take any one behavior that you have. Like, for instance, why do you like coffee more than tea? And when you start to think about why you like coffee, you might just say, well, I don't know, I just have a preference towards coffee. Well, why do you have a preference? Well, you aren't really in a position to know why you have that preference. It's just sort of the wiring of your brain. And that's what we're trying to basically show here, is that these things deep down, you really don't have any control on whether or not you like coffee more than you like tea. You just sort of came that way. Maybe you had an experience, or maybe not, or maybe it was your genes. So something that really elucidates this is thinking about your wants, and your preferences you don't have control over, and also what you want you don't have control over. So take this really interesting example. Think about your mom. Think about whether or not you want to punch her in the face. Now, most people are going to say no. I don't want to punch my mom in the face. And now, without changing anything about your mom, is there any possible way that you could change yourself to all of a sudden want to punch your mom in the face? It's an impossible task. And so that elucidates that we really don't have control over our preferences, our wants, and our behaviors as well.
Exactly. Yeah, and another example that we could use on that is that this is a little bit of a controversial subject. But I think a lot of people now that are our age at least agree that you don't have choice on your sexual orientation, which portrays that you don't have free will in that arena. Because if you did have free will in that arena, you could just change your sexual orientation. So I think most people that are our age that grew up as millennials agree that if you're gay, you can't decide to be straight. Now, maybe you don't agree with that. Maybe you're like, no, they could change it. If they could find God and become better, then they would be able to change it. Well, then flip that logic on the opposite. Let's say you are straight and you like girls. Imagine trying to get yourself to want guys if you're a man. Or if you're a girl, imagine yourself trying to want women. There's no value judgment there. I'm just pointing out the fact that changing your desires is an impossible thing to do. And that elucidates the point that we don't have free will.
Yeah, and to add a caveat to that too, when you look at behavior and the way humans act, it is possible in the right context to more or less get somebody to change what they want, right? But again, you're pulling strings in an external way here. So for example, if I were to, make somebody want to get their life together, someone who's just a couch bum, who doesn't want to do anything with their life, you can do certain things that might make that person change their wants. So wants are changeable. It's just that you, at the current time, in the current state of the universe, have no control over whether or not your wants change. And if your wants do change due to a change internally or a change in the world, you are of no perspective to understand why that change happened. Yeah. And that change is basically happening to you. Exactly. And all these forces are being externally applied towards you, and that's what's causing you to change in that way.
And that example that Derick just gave, actually, I was a little confused about that at first too. I was like, how is it that I can want to change things and not have free will? Well, it's kind of like if you were to look at chemistry. How do you make a certain chemical reaction happen? Chemical reactions don't have any free will. They're not deciding to change, but that doesn't mean that they're unchangeable. Given the right circumstances, anything can change from one state to another, but there's no volition. There's no place where a decision is being made from a simple like matter perspective of chemistry. Now, obviously, that example doesn't encapsulate the complexity of a human being, but if you get behind this idea that we're talking about, if you were to say something like, what you guys are saying isn't true, I can change right now. I'm going to prove it by clicking out of this video because I believe that I have free will. Well, you can't choose to do the opposite of something that we say. Like, if you hear us saying things like, we don't believe in free will, and then you're like, well, I'll prove it right now, you don't choose to want to prove it.
Yeah, and to add on that, in this moment, like, if what we're saying makes sense to you, you had no control over that. It's just making sense to you right now. But if all of a sudden you're sitting here and you're like, what are these guys talking about? You had no choice to feel that way. That feeling just sort of arose. And when you really drill down on why that came up, you know, you really aren't in a position to know why you disagree with us.
Exactly.
Or why you feel like we're making sense and talking coherently right now.
Exactly. And we'll go into on the next one, where do these feelings come from? Where do these arising events come from? And they come from a cause and effect relationship of everything that has ever happened in all the possible outcomes of the past. All right, guys, so now we're going to jump into the next example, and it's what we call the cause and effect perspective. This is simply the idea that every single thing that happens is caused by all other things that have happened, and the most easy way to understand that for most people, I think, is just the butterfly effect. It's not necessarily exactly the butterfly effect, but most people already understand what that is, so that's always what I introduce it as, because that just makes a lot of sense intuitively. So it just means that if you change one thing, it changes everything. So like if you put a butterfly in a T-Rex field or some shit, like, you know, however, 65 million years ago, and then that effect would cause everything to be different today. So that's just the butterfly effect, and it's just the simple idea that every single thing that happens is caused by all other things that happened, and there's a causal relationship between all future outcomes based on everything that has happened in the present and in the past.
Yep. So basically everything is connected to everything. And you can use this with everything or anything. Like, why did we just eat Chipotle? Well, you know, we have a preference. We like the taste of Chipotle. And then you can keep going. Why do we like the taste of Chipotle? Well, it's the particular wiring of our brain, and maybe something to do with our olfactory system too. Well, now you could ask the question, why is our brain wired in that way where we like Chipotle? Well, that is because the specific environmental, genetic, epigenetic, prenatal environments that we are exposed to, all of those factors build up to the point that we have a specific layout of neurons that like those things. Now, why were all of those environmental, genetic, epigenetic, prenatal contexts there? Well, because that was the circumstance that arose from all the other prior conditions at that point. It's like, to answer any question, even the simplest of questions, you, in a sense, have to go all the way back to the beginning of time.
Exactly. And that ties into whether or not you believe in randomness or whether or not you believe in souls again. Because let's say you believe in souls, so you're like, well, my soul lets me make decisions. Well, it's like, why do souls let you make decisions? Because God made it that way. Why did God make it that way? Because God is the kind of creature that would design it in that kind of way. Well, why is he the kind of creature that would design it in that way? Well, it's because of the way that God is made up. And it's like, you can see how that just goes into infinite regression too. And all of these things that we're saying, how does this have to do with free will? Well, it's basically just saying that all cause and effect relationships, whether you're talking about the butterfly effect like I was saying, or us eating Chipotle like Derick was saying, or if it's randomness, or if it's souls, it's just saying that we personally do not have control of all of the causes and effects. You might have control of some of them, but that doesn't mean that like 5 days ago when you saw the word ice cream on a billboard and that subconsciously cued you to want to eat ice cream a week later, you had no control whether or not you would see that. Our cause and effect relationship to all things is completely out of our control. The fact that acceleration is 9.8 meters per second has given the rise to all human life, and we have no control over that. The fact that the Earth is the perfect distance from the sun, we have no control over that either.
Yeah, and I think there's an important disclaimer here too, because some people can get it confused when you say we don't have any control over the cause or effects, and it's like you really got to be careful what you're talking about there, because you see humans controlling things all the time and being a part of the web of cause and effect. You know, like Hitler was part of the web of cause and effect. He did things, he controlled things that caused, you know, the life to be the way it is now.
Exactly.
However, he is just part of that web, and the reason he did things was because of prior reasons in the web.
Yeah, like he had no control of the kind of brain he was given, like we said. He had no control over anything that happened in the past that created him the way he is. So it's really all of those cause and effect relationships that are completely outside of us, that affect us every single moment of every single second of every single day of our entire lives, and then everything that we do also affects everything in the future.
Right.
And if you want to look into this more in a complex way, the first philosophers that really got into this idea, and I think, I don't know, were those Buddhists in the Bhadvahitvisarya? They didn't believe in free will, even though they didn't call it Hindu. They didn't call it free will though, right?
Yeah, they didn't call it free will.
The first people to ever come up with this in philosophy is what they called the concept praticesumupada, which means dependent origination or dependent causation. And
dependent arising.
Dependent arising. It just means that every single thing is based on all cause and effect relationships of everything that's happened. And that's pretty much what we're trying to say, is that the cause and effect relationships to things are what deem things to happen and not necessarily things that we are doing.
Yeah, and it's really easy if you just break it down. Like, nothing happens without a reason.
This is the only principle you need to understand. Nothing ever happens without a reason. Everything was determined by something prior. That's it. Now, take a computer. Give it all the data that can exist about this pen rolling across the table. Its trajectory, velocity, mass of its component parts, atomic structure. What can the computer now tell you? It can tell you how hard the pen was pushed, and it can tell you when the pen will stop rolling. The computer can see backwards. The computer can see forwards. Now do that with everything.
And you can take anything, you know, like what happens without a reason, and just bring up any example. You know, like some, you know, person was hit by a car today, you know. That is totally explainable. And again, the only way to explain it is by explaining everything else in the web of connected events since the beginning of time, right?
Yeah.
Nothing happens outside of this web, so.
Yeah, because you could say, why was that person hit in a car accident today? You could say it's because a drunk driver was driving, but why was that person drunk? It's because they have a predisposition towards alcoholism. Why do humans have a predisposition towards alcoholism? Because of all the multitude of factors that you could say are the causes of that. But then you could say, what if alcohol had never been invented? Then this never could have happened. So you could even go back to the origins of alcohol being invented. Then you could say, why does alcohol chemically exist in the way it does? And then you get into chemistry. And then you say, why does chemistry allow itself to exist that way? Because of physics.
Yeah.
And it's just, it never ends. It never ends. All things are originating from things that are completely outside of us and go on into
Forever.
infinity.
Yep.
There's no point where the next word that comes out of my mouth is independent from all other things that have happened. It's not my choice that I'm speaking English. You know?
Yeah, you can't step out of that web of causality.
Exactly.
It wouldn't make any sense.
It wouldn't make any sense.
You would have to be something supernatural that would step out of the web of causality. But then it's like, how would that thing act if there wasn't any causes to affect the action of that thing, right?
Yep.
So you even get into problems in the metaphysical and in the supernatural.
Yeah.
But I think that's sort of the gist of it, is that everything's connected and that everything is explainable by what caused it.
All right, guys, so those are the three main arguments that we first introduce whenever we bring up that we believe that free will is an illusion. However, this topic is a conversation that can go on for hours and hours. So if there's anything that you found confusing or anything that you agreed with, just leave it in the comments and let us know, and maybe we'll make a video about it in the future. But But Derek's going to jump into what we talked about at the beginning on why would we ever want to end up in a situation where we did believe this is an illusion, and how could this possibly tie into self-growth?
Yeah. So the first thing that's really clear on how it makes you a better person is the empathy that it gives you for everybody else. Because once you understand that even murderers and the worst people in society are just victims of all the prior causations that are essentially controlling them, you realize that there's no rational basis for a deep hatred of that person, because ultimately they didn't have responsibility over their actions at all. So at the end of the day, we can still punish them. I think, like we talked about briefly, if that makes sense within our judicial system as a deterrent for other people, but it makes no sense to inflict suffering upon people for something they've done, just for the pure gratification on your part that they're somehow deserving it. Like, nobody really deserves suffering, right? We're all just victims of our prior causation. So it really takes away hatred. And then the way I like to, I think it's sort of an interesting thing, because the studies show that when you show somebody, or when you make an argument against free will for somebody, and then you assign them to do a task with other people, it's like they're less helpful, they're more selfish, they try less hard. So it's like, sort of does seem a lot of the times like reminding yourself that we don't have free will might not be the best in just like practicality, And we were talking about this earlier too. It's like, it's really hard to put yourself into that state where you don't feel like you have free will. So it doesn't make sense to do it often. And the way I like to think about self-growth within the context of free will is thinking about free will and the fact that we're just, victims of the causations, and we're just materialistic beings, right? That are just subject to everything and the laws of physics. I like to think of that as like the hardware of the human computer. And then our mind, our mindset, our beliefs, that's sort of the software that runs on top of it. And that sort of thing is what I pay attention to. I pay attention to my beliefs and my intentions and what I want. And I think of that in a software type of way, where it's not necessarily, it doesn't have to make sense with the hardware, right? Windows 7 doesn't have any correlation to, the chips in your computer. They look nothing alike. They're completely different, right? And the software is virtual in a sense, right? So I think about the software of my belief system and believing that I can change, believing that I have effect on the world and I have effect on myself, and I can take control over my environment and myself. So that's the operating system in which I go throughout my day as if it were true.
Yeah. And whenever we're talking about the software, a lot of the time that is like self-growth stuff. Like when I was talking earlier about the fight thing, where I'm like, I was never someone who could just think I was going to win a fight dogmatically. It's coming from the perspective that, look, man, like I am in sales, so I do understand that when I'm about to go knock on a door, I have to believe that they're going to sign up with me, because if I don't have that airtight mindset, then it will lead the outcome more likely into a situation where I won't be able to get a signature. So I'm not saying not to use the software of mindset and all these things, but just know that when we're talking about the nature of reality, we're talking about the true hardware of what we are. What does it mean to be a human being? Not what does it feel like to be a human being subjectively. Because what a human is objectively versus what a human feels like it is subjectively are very different things. And that's all we're talking about. And you could even ironically use a biblical analogy to explain this. It's kind of like knowledge is like biting the forbidden fruit. And once you know it, you can never leave this knowledge behind. But I would just challenge myself, and I do challenge myself, and I know you do too, Derick, that it's really important to us to know the truth. And some people, what truth is to them is different than us, but truly, like, there's certain things that, like we said early on, that I just felt like I couldn't believe. And this is something that I just have deeply resonated with for a long time. So I really think
that's
just a value system almost. Yeah, which is so ironic.
And that adds to how it would better your life too. Is like, if you're someone that struggles with piecing together, the fact that we have free will, but then you look at science and the progress that we're seeing and how it contradicts with it on every level. coming to grips with the fact that free will makes no sense and just accepting that as your belief, that we don't have free will, can solve a lot of internal dissonance.
Yeah, cognitive dissonance.
A lot of cognitive dissonance, and you can go about your life with more clarity, right?
Yeah.
And so in a way, you can make an argument that can make you more of a congruent person because you don't have as much conflict in your life.
Yeah.
Because you've sort of, and I know I'm personally like that. Like if something doesn't make sense, if I sense like a contradiction somewhere in my belief system, then I spend a lot of time thinking about it.
Yeah.
And it sucks away from me trying to be a better, more productive member of society. So that could be an argument too for why it helps you.
And these are the more like nuanced, like personal reasons for just you and me. Like, we've known each other for like 7 years now. So like we've thought deeply on this. Like this is what matters to us. But
a lot of people it won't matter.
A lot of people this won't matter.
But you probably won't be watching this video if it doesn't matter.
Yeah, these are the personal things that have helped us, and know that like when we first learned this stuff, like it did put us into a dark headspace, but it put me into a lighter headspace to have solved this Rubik's Cube,
right,
than to have never picked it up to begin with. Because if I always knew it was there in the back of my mind, it would knot me my whole life. And that's really the personal reasons that I would say you and me have gotten into this.
Yeah.
But just remember that the very, very clear reasons to not believe in free will are what Derick was saying. It gives you more empathy because it makes you realize everyone is a victim. But if you realize everyone else is a victim, not only does that prove that, but it also proves that you are too, and all of your successes and failures are not at your fault too. So in the same way that the hardships in your life, they give you the victim feeling where you're like, it's okay, it's not something that was a consequence of anything I could have changed. It also gives you the humility in your wins to realize that any success that I have in my own life is of no consequence of me. Like I was just gifted this brain that I have, this environment that I was given, that I was born in this time period, and it gives you a feeling of humility and like thankfulness to have what you have been given. So it's funny that these lines can be blurred into spiritual truths.
Yeah, and I would say, just to summarize that, it humbles your ego.
Yeah.
And it also, if things aren't going so well for you in life, it allows you to not hate yourself.
Yeah.
And to have a little bit more love for yourself, and realize that, hey, you were just doing exactly what you always would have done, given that the universe was in the state that it was in the past when you were making those decisions. So it's like, it really brings it down. It brings down your ego, and it makes it so you can't hate yourself either.
Yeah.
So,
but just always remembering that like this shit is such a mind fuck. Like it really is. Like it's so much more of a nuanced thing than the simplicities that I find challenging to believe. And I really have found that as I learn more and more and I read more and more books, me and Derick read a lot of books, like probably hundreds of books combined between the two of us over the last 5 years, I realize that things almost always are more complicated than I believed they were before I had the information that I consumed on that subject.
Yeah, it's like the deeper you go into reality, and almost
the deeper
fractals.
it gets deeper.
Yeah, it's just like within that little area of understanding, there's just another fractal, a deeper understanding. So it's like life is very complex, and so the truth is in the nuance. And the more you can dive into the nuance, the better you're sort of going to feel about your belief system being accurate and also effective. And it's just, to me, it's really just about balancing that. You know?
And that's
if I'm all in on accuracy, then I might lose a little bit of efficiency in my life, and if I'm all in on efficiency, I might lose a little bit of accuracy. And it's really up to you to just whichever one you value more, and I guess whichever one you value more really isn't up to your control anyway, so you're going to do it either way.
And just coming to grips with the nuances of things, that like you can decide that certain things could help you if you can believe in them, and we're just saying we're not people that could believe in simple things. Because there is the philosophy that there are things you should believe in that are not true but are useful.
Right.
What is that, Buddhism? Or who talked about that?
That's that's
because we prescribe that too.
Pragmatism.
Pragmatism.
Yeah, that's like Jordan Peterson sort of school of thought.
Yeah.
Where what is true is what makes you more effective, right?
Yeah.
In a pragmatic sense. And so there is an element of that, like we're talking about. And that's sort of where it comes in with thinking about things as an operating system. Because there are beliefs that you can have, but you can believe them, and then,
they're good. They're good things to believe.
It makes you more effective, not because they're true. And you can hold those separate, because once you recognize that our brain All right, guys, sorry, our camera just died on us. A random event that's probably explainable by everything else that ever happened. So we're just gonna wrap up this video now, and we're, in the future, gonna go into some more aspects of free will. Today was sort of just an intro video on the main 3 arguments that have convinced us, but we'll go into some of the implications and whatnot of free will in later.
That's what got me into it, is that like it's fucking weird that we actually don't have free will, because I don't actually feel like I don't have free will. Like I really don't. Like I feel like I have free will. Like day to day, like even as I'm saying this, I really do. Like every time I think about it, just like emotionally, and never am like, yeah, I'm not choosing the next word that comes out of my mouth.